I'll tell you from my perspective at IBM, we didn't really get impacted significantly. I've been working from home since April of 2002. And so, 19 years working from home, the fact that the pandemic had everybody working from home didn't impact me significantly. Yes, it meant that, my kids were also home and everyone, but it didn't make a difference to me. We already had all the collaboration tools going. We were used to working remotely. Most of our learning as an organization, most of our learning had already transitioned to digital learning. We did have some face to face learning, but it wasn't significant. And so, the impact on a company like IBM was not significant. But then you look at some other organizations, even large organizations like a bank. My husband works for Bank of America. They were severely impacted because they were all face to face. They had to figure out how to, do this. Since they were essential workers, the retail business continued, but everybody else went home. And so that was really hard. And what we've seen as a result of that is really a huge shift, right? Because we're seeing more than 100 million workers may need to reskill themselves completely because some of those jobs are actually never coming back. And so, as learning professionals, we're really tasked with how do we look at adjusting for the changes that the pandemic has brought, and at the same time, staying mindful about what the future is going to need, because the future is completely unknown as far as we're concerned. In the past, whenever I used to talk about the future of work, it was just the future of work. But now when we talk about it, it's the work, it's the worker, and it's the workplace, because it's not only what we do, but who's doing it and where it's being done, which has really, really become part of the conversation. So when we talk about the workplace, we're all talking about hybrid work at this point. Yes, there are some organizations that have gone back 100%, but those are few and far in between. Mostly it's going to be hybrid work, right? So you're going to have some people still opting to stay remote, or in the case like IBM, where, a lot of the organization was already remote. And then you've got people who have to be in the office. People are now choosing to be hybrid. I remember whenever I told someone that I work from home, I'd get a lot of quizzical questions like, you actually work from home? How do you work? What kind of work do you do? And I've done all kinds of work from home, right? And I know there are a lot of naysayers out there who felt, oh, if we go, allow someone to work from home, they're going to be slacking off. I know my mother-in-law also used to ask me, she's like, oh, then you have no problem getting your laundry done and your food cooked. And I'm like, what? Of course, like it's a normal working day. I've got back-to-back calls. And so, our whole shift, the way of working has changed, the way we think about work has changed. And hybrid work now also has increased what we call the inequity in a work environment, right? How do we really manage a meeting, for instance, which has a few people on site, but also has a lot of people remote? How do we make sure that we include the people who are remote and make them feel as part of the conversation as much as the two people who are inside the room? So that's a big change. The other change is really thinking through efficient resilience, right? I don't know about you, but I think the word resilience is something that I had never, ever given so much thought to. I think it's it's like one of those words that rose into fame during the pandemic, because all of a sudden the ability to bounce back, the ability to really um, navigate through, this time that was changing on us every single day without losing a beat, without stopping being positive, became so, so imperative. And so, this whole conversation about being resilient and having the resilience to deal with this change became a, a really critical factor. Empathetic leadership. Again, it's something that has changed. My daughter was class of 2020, so she was a senior when the pandemic hit. And as you can imagine, she lost her prom, she lost her graduation, she lost all those things that a typical senior goes through. And to me, again, I've had kids go through the school system. I've been a very involved parent, but I never paid attention to the school leadership. I never paid attention to who was the school superintendent, what kind of person was that, who was the school principal. Um, but now, all of a sudden, even at a school level and at town level, the leadership became really important because the decisions that they were making on a day to day basis impacted you significantly. And then let's talk about work. At work, things needed to change. We saw all kinds of things, right? So at IBM, we had one person, and this is a kind of a nice story. It was part of the consulting team, and this lady had, I think, a 2-year-old, and she was in the middle of a customer meeting, and her 2-year-old threw a tantrum and wanted mommy. There was nothing that the dad could do to make this baby stop crying. And she was working herself up into such a state that finally the father just walked into where she was doing this meeting and handed her the child, apologized to people on the screen, and said, I'm really sorry, but this child needs her mom at this time. And this woman was absolutely mortified because here she was in the middle of a customer meeting with this 2-year-old child. Well, needless to say, people were a little shocked, but then someone started talking to the baby. Within a couple of minutes, the child was pacified and quiet, and she was able to hand the child back to the dad and continue with the presentation. What was amazing here was the leader of that team, this was part of the IBM consulting team, realized that he needed to do something at this point. And he created what was called the work from home pledge, which was amazing. It went right across IBM where it said, I pledge to support family, I pledge to be kind to one another, I pledge to, manage work situations, et cetera, et cetera. But what it really did was it gave people the right to be vulnerable. It gave people the right to have children melt down at work, because for some people, this was a, a new situation, right? Consulting, IBM Consulting never does work remote. They are at a customer site all the time. So this was something new for them. And so it requires leaders to be completely different, because they can see into their employees' homes. They can, they have to be able to deal with the issues that homeschooling brought along, COVID exposures brought along. And so this was an uncomfortable place for a lot of leaders. They've never had to do this soft, warm, touchy, feely kind of stuff, right? So I think it called into attention this need for empathetic leadership. And then the employee experience kind of changed, from being a provider of a paycheck, an organization went to becoming the center of, one's mental and, social well-being. So to top it all, we also had the social unrest that happened in the United States that became such a big issue. And so we saw all of these things change, and all of these things really requiring a new contract between employees and employers. Organizations changed completely. And so, whether it's from a leadership perspective, whether it was the culture of an organization, now, if you talk to anybody, they want to work only for an ethical organization, right? You're making money, that's great. But what are you doing for the environment? How are you helping skilling? All of a sudden, the corporate social responsibility mandates for an organization have become very important. Talent requirements. People want companies to be invested in their professional development. If I'm going to spend 8 hours or 10 hours of my day with you, yes, I'm working for you, you're paying me a paycheck, but at the same time, I need to be able to know that you have my back, that you're going to be developing me as a professional, not only so that I can do the job for you, but also because so that I can be a future fit employee. And then, of course, from an inclusion perspective, all the conversations I know whilst we were talking during the networking, a lot of you are doing D&I stuff. Before the pandemic, how many people ever talked about D&I? Yes, at large companies, yes. But across the board now, DEIB has become a big part of learning and development and all conversations across the board. So what's really happened is we've transitioned to a human-centered organization. Now all decisions are really centered around the person, the employee, and which is why I said, yes, when we're talking about organizational resilience, it's a collective resilience of all the humans or the employees who are part of this organization, right? And I can't see the chat, so if there are any questions, please feel free to stop me. So again, these are stats all of us have seen. I'm not going to repeat them. But one of the things that I would like to call out is the fact that the time it takes to close a skills gap is really, really increasing. It's become 10 times of in the last 4 years. So when they talk about the half-life of skills, I think it used to be 5 years. Now it's less than 2. So 50% of your skills are becoming redundant every 2 years. And so obviously having to close that skills gap, is becoming imperative. And the time it takes to close the skills gap is increasing because of the kind of skills that we need to deliver, right? So their technical skills, their foundational skills, their business skills, but it's all becoming more and more complicated. As learning organizations, we know it's becoming a lot more difficult to close that skills gap. So basically, we're rewriting the learning rule book. I think for most of you here, you probably have had to employ completely different tactics when it comes to learning. For the smaller organization, April, May, like your organization, where you were 100%, face-to-face, now you're having to think about remote learning. In the bank, again, I'm sure, Donna, you have had to think about how do we do new employee training? Laura, you onboarded into a brand new organization during the pandemic? How do we onboard people? How do we get them to get that feeling of belonging, even though we did this in a remote environment? So onboarding, continuous training, diversity and inclusion training, making sure that we are also keeping up with all the technology changes that are coming up, really required the learning and development professionals to think again. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the work of Adam Grant, but he's got a wonderful book called Think Again, which really talks about how you need to stop. We all have all these norms and things that we've always done the way we've done, but there is an opportunity for all of us to stop and think again. Is what we're doing, does it serve us today, given that the environment has changed? Is it going to serve us tomorrow as we move forward? So when we think about an organization and really what's going to drive organizational resilience, if I take you back to those four imperatives, the four things that have really changed for an organization, right? We talked about hybrid work, we talked about leadership, we talked about inclusion and belonging, talent development. They're all skill things, right? They're all skill topics, because we need to teach leaders how to become more empathetic, how to manage a hybrid workforce, how to talk about diversity and inclusion, and really how do they make someone feel as if they belong, right? These are all things that managers never had to do before. Let's talk about performance-based thing. Wendy, you were talking about how you hate doing performance evaluations. Now, doing performance evaluations has become even more difficult for the managers, because earlier, the people were in front of their eyes, right? So they could see the work that they were doing. Now they can't. So part of it is how do they now evaluate someone who they don't see? How do they think about what really qualifies as performance? And how do they keep people motivated in a remote environment? How do they evaluate people? How do they make sure that accountability is there, because people are not used to working in that? These are all things that require new skills. And then on top of that, we've got this huge shift coming with technology, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's the cloud, it all requires new skills. And so what we're really seeing at the core of an organization, for an organization to be resilient, they really need to have the right kind of skills, the right kind of skills to manage, the right kind of skills to do their business, and the right kind of skills to be able to continuously adapt. And so the three key actions are: one, really make purposeful investments in people. In order to do that, you've got to foster a culture of learning, because, and we can talk about that. And then the third thing is really looking outside in, building collaboration across both internal and external stakeholders. Again, for organizations that are small, this may not be a big deal, but for larger organizations, it is a significant work effort. So when we talk about making a personal investment, it has to start with, where are we today? And I'll take the example of IBM. About 5 years ago, I think it was 5 or 6 years ago, we realized that we needed to have a way of taking inventory of the skills in our organization. And there was no way of doing that at that point. And one of the things that we did was we adopted a badge program. And so we followed the Mozilla Open Badge standards. We started defining badges for the various learning activities that the employees were taking. And over a period of time, we had a skills inventory with the help of those badges. And we can talk about that a little bit more. But the first step is take a skills inventory, whether it's having employees take a personal assessment to do it, or if you set an organizational wide enterprise skills assessment, but really having the employees take an assessment so that you know where they are today. Identifying roles and skills required in the future. This is a conversation, and it was nice to hear how some of you who were earlier learning people are now as generalist HRs, some of you who are generalist HRs now becoming learning, because there needs to be this really tight collaboration between learning, HR, and the business, because they need to work together to be able to really identify from a business perspective, what is our 2-year, 3-year, 5-year plan going to be? What are the kind of roles and skills that we're going to require from a talent perspective? And then HR needs to work closely with learning to be able to figure out, how do we do the talent development for this? How do we do the talent acquisition? How do we really retain talent so that we can progress them through different stops, so that we're not constantly having to acquire and onboard new training, new talent. And then performing skill adjacencies. This is particularly interesting, I think, as we've seen, some roles that have gone away completely. So let's take the example of the hospitality, right? Hotels. When hotels closed, all the front desk people, everyone, the concierge, all of those people kind of lost their jobs. But then on the other hand, there were other organizations that were largely skilling up. Let's talk about the grocery stores that were largely skilling up. A lot of the online retailers were largely skilling up. If you look at the skills profile of what, let's say, the front desk or the concierge people had versus what was required by these grocery stores and online retailers, they all required customer service skills. And so even though from a domain or an industry perspective, there wasn't a one-to-one map, there was the skill adjacency mapping by role. So a front desk person had all the customer service skills that perhaps an online retailer needed. At the bank, I know a colleague of my husband, she's around 60 or 65. She just didn't feel comfortable. She used to be a banking center manager. She just didn't feel comfortable working at the bank anymore. And so she opted to go remote. And so, she'd never managed a call center, but now the call volume at the bank had gone completely out of the roof. And so they made her in charge of a call center. And so she had to pick up some new skills, but largely speaking, she knew how to manage a bank. She knew how to manage employees. She knew how to do scheduling, things like that. So some basic skills she still had. And then she just had to learn some job specific new skills. And so the whole skill adjacency mapping needs to be done. I'm talking about a very basic level, but then if we think about from a technology perspective also, today there's a need for Python programmers. Everyone's looking for Python programmers. Well, there might be people who've learned other programs. They might not have Python skills. They might have C skills, C++ skills, COBOL skills. It's still a programming language. Those are still adjacencies. they are going to be able to skill up a lot faster than someone who doesn't have those skills. So that's very important, trying to identify where we are today. A word of caution when we're thinking about where you want to go. Very often we tend to get stuck into this, we're tempted to try and predict skills and predict and say, oh, I think, we're going to need, our skills, or we're going to need machine learning skills, or we're going to need, if you're in the bank, we're going to need all the ATMs are going to go away. And so, we're probably going to need to reskill. But then along comes a complete disruption that changes things all over again for you. And so one of the things that I love about this thing about Gartner is they're talking about how you think about a dynamic approach to skill shifts, right? One is a skill sensing network. Don't work within a small silo of just your organization. Work with a lot of different groups within your organization to try and figure out what are the various skills requirements across the network. And then think about skills accelerators, right? How do you develop people for a project that they need particular skills for at that particular point of time? How do you identify those skill adjacencies that are going to help accelerate them? So those are targeted skill accelerators. And then thinking about a two-way skills transparency, because remember, when we're talking about a personalized learning journey, the beginning we talked about making a personalized investment in people. It needs to, one, appeal to their sense and sensibilities, their interests. It has to be a good earning path for them, but it also needs to be open so that you can have an open and honest conversation with an employee to say, look, you're doing, your, let's say, again, I'm going to pick a random example, but someone has, the only job someone has is servicing ATMs. And we know that ATMs are going to go away in 5 years. We need to have a very honest and open conversation with that person and say, look, your job is 100% focused on servicing ATMs today, but we know that's going to go away. And so I need you to make sure that you understand this is where the jobs are going to be, and you need to skill up accordingly. So that transparency, to have that two-way conversation, is really important. The other thing is, instead of focusing on specific technical skills or very specific process-driven skills or things, think more about foundational skills, because we have seen that if foundational skills are built out, it gives people the ability to pick up new skills no matter what. So if a person can do critical thinking and analysis, or a person, in general, has a high stress tolerance, they're going to be able to pivot and adapt a lot faster, which is going to give them the ability to reskill themselves based on whatever needs you need very, very quickly. I talked about this in the beginning. We talked about how digital transformation was something that organizations who were already well down their path of digital transformation, were able to bounce back from the pandemic a lot faster. One of the things that we have seen is that the learning that we're going through, or the learning experiences that you were responsible for in your organization, need to be digitized pretty much, now. I mean, I'm sure you've already digitized them, but whatever's left in terms of not being digitized really needs to be digitized. And we also need to think about it as a continuous learning. So we talked about we talked about badges. one of the things that we found with badges was the fact that we ran a pilot. So IBM has this open platform. It's called Cognitive Class. If you go check it out, it doesn't have IBM anywhere on it. It's not an IBM branded property. It has 100% self-paced topics. And one of the things that they were battling with, like any online platform, was that it was a free platform. And so people would enroll in courses and never finish them. And so one of the things that we did as part of the pilot when we launched badges, besides launching them internally, we wanted to test the impact of badges on some of this external education. And so we went ahead and put badge certain activities on that cognitive class. What was interesting was we saw completions go up by over 300%. All of a sudden, people were completing courses because they were interested in getting that badge. They were interested in putting that badge on their LinkedIn profile because one, it really it indicated to anybody looking at them or a potential employer as to what skills that they had. It was verified skills because this person had taken an assessment to get that badge. And so it was a way to reward them, right? So, and we found that people who were taking this learning were motivated then to take the next course in the learning path and get the next badge and then get the next badge. So it really helped the skills progression. It helped the stickiness of training because it was this constant reward that they were getting. The other thing was is master the modulate all the learning, make small chunk size, bite size learning. That's another thing that we have seen as you look at the skills requirement for what's happening with people today in terms of projects. On one particular project, someone may be a quality assurance person. On another project, they may be a PM. They might have to do some project management. On a third one, they might be a technical writer. And so what we need to do is be able to deliver learning that can provide these discrete skills to people based on the projects that they are in. And so it's becoming more and more important to develop bite-sized learning, modular learning, so that people do not necessarily have to take the whole thing. So if for a particular project, I am one of the PMs on it, it doesn't mean that I need to take a PMI track end to end. It just means I need to take some basics of project management so that I know how to use a Gantt chart. I know how to run Scrum calls. I know, some basic stuff I need to know. And so, which is why it's important that I don't have to take the whole project management 101 track, but really pick out pieces that are relevant to me for this project to be able to do it. And so that's why, building out modular training has become really important. We've already talked about how to, reward people, to motivate them and get them moving. And then, of course, we're talking about the agile manifesto. And so, this is really great because at the end of the day, like we've said, we can only build out organizational resilience if people are resilient, right? And what does personal resilience really mean? Personal resilience is one, a personality resilience. Like, how do we make someone strong? How do you make someone adaptable? How do you make someone have a positive attitude? But then the other part of that resilience on a personal level is what I call career resilience, right? How do you make someone resilient to any change so that they become, positive contributors to the work, no matter what? And career resilience comes from this infinite learning loop. And so, really driving a learn it all attitude. I think all of you have probably, as learning professionals, have heard about, the transition that Microsoft made under Satya Nadella from a know it all to a learn it all thing. That's what turned Microsoft around, according to Satya Nadella, right? So this is one of those things where we're talking about, one, it's a continuous learning loop. Two, what's really critical here is the fact that you're tying the learning to earning. It's not learning for the sake of learning, but it's because they can actually see how by acquiring these skills, they can either switch career paths or they can get a different role, which can help improve their career prospects and help them, in their livelihood. So it kind of is an earning multiplier for them. It's based on motivation multipliers. So we're talking about credentials, we're talking about modular bite-sized learning, so that you feel as if you've acquired the skills and you're moving on. Just-in-time microbursts, it's all about learning in the flow of work rather than doing discrete learning activities. Dynamic pathways. This one I think is a really interesting one, because as I was giving you an example, a person may be different things on different teams. And so today, the career path of an individual is not linear. I can guarantee you, as we all talk about our careers, each one of us has taken a zigzag path to get to where we are. I don't think any of us have taken a simple straight path. And we've done a lot of different things along the way, which really help make out, our career portfolio. And I think what's really going to help moving forward is this whole progressive layering concept, which is, besides learning, as an example, besides learning about L&D today, I also have to learn about data visualization, right? So, in order to run an effective learning program today, we have to be able to understand the data in terms of who's taking our learning, how much of the learning is being completed. If it's digital learning, why is someone abandoning the learning? What can be done to fix it from an organization perspective? Building out that skills inventory, doing a heat map of skills. All of those things require you to be able to use data, visualize it, to be able to tell a story. So besides being an L&D professional, now you've got to do that too. I don't know about you guys, but one of the skills that I had to kind of learn, which I hated, but I had to learn, was how to make a video during the pandemic. That was a critical skill. Again, something that I have never had to do, and I'm not a content developer who does video, but I write, but I still had to learn how to do a video. I had to learn how to do storyboarding. I had to learn how to do transcription for 17 different languages for a particular video. These are all layers of skills that help us become more well-rounded individuals. The other thing that, as we start building out these learning paths, they need to be adaptive. They need to change based on how the person is learning and the skills that the person already comes to the table with, right? So the importance of it being AI driven and personalized becomes really, really key. And the last one is this whole community compounding piece. You know, we tend to call it gamification, though I don't think it's really gamification, but the whole concept of leaderboards and, the rage of, the YouTube influencers. If you guys have kids who are teens, they're all about talking about the influencers. What are influencers? This is nothing but social amplification, right? So you take a celebrity, and the celebrity is wearing something, the whole world wants to wear it. Now let's apply that in learning. You've got a leader that might want to model some behavior, may want people to take a particular course. It might be design thinking or something. You have that leader take that course, talk about it. That is going to amplify and going to help other people learn it. Same thing with someone who has very high credibility in the organization for a particular skill. The social amplification and the community compounding of the effect of how people want to emulate and how people want to follow these influences is very key. And so those are some of the things that we've got to think about as we build out our learning experiences. And if you notice, I'm not talking about courses, I'm not talking about assets, I'm talking about a learning experience, because that's what it has to be. You're not trying to get someone to take a course, you're building out a learning experience for them so that they're heavily invested in it, whatever the learning experience might be. The last point was, collaborating across different teams. Again, as we start to build content out for all these new skills that we need, we can spend years trying to build out all the leadership skills we need, the new way of working, the resilience, the diversity, or we can figure out what is our core competency to develop. What can we go acquire outside from a third party? Can we go to a Coursera? Can we go to a LinkedIn Learning? Can we go to a Plural site to acquire some of that learning? That is not part of our core competency. As a bank, yes, I need to develop the learning that's on my processes, my systems, my ATMs, my compliance. But do I need to build out general soft skill training, general critical thinking training, general data analytics? No, you don't. You can go ahead and acquire that, right? So really building out a partner ecosystem that can help you from a content acquisition perspective, from experiences. How do you give different people in your organization different skill sets by putting them onto projects into different teams? I'll tell you, at IBM, I have tried to get into HR, I think for the last 12 years, and I have not succeeded because HR is a very closed organization. I might have a lot of L&D experience, but I don't have HR specific experience. I just wish they'd do stretch assignments so that I get a stretch assignment in HR. And so that would give me some of the HR experience so that the next time there's a job open in HR and apply, I have some relevant experience. So those are kind of experiences that we need to hard code and build into our organizations. So for you specifically as learning development folks, if you are in an organization where you're doing this for your customers, a lot of you are doing it for yourselves, but like Amol, you used to work for Kaplan, maybe you were doing it for a customer, really looking to help your customers. How do you develop outcome-driven learning? Again, bite-sized, multiple modalities, because we've got a hybrid workplace now. It needs to be personalized, self-directed learning, right? So the learning paths have to be very clear. They have to be adaptive. There has to be skills progression. People have to know, I start here, do this next, and end here. And maybe I get a new job, I get a badge, I get a certification. At ATD, you all do this, right? There are credits that go against the acquisition of a certain certificate. These are all examples of really driving that skills progression and driving the culture of lifelong learning. And finally, this is an important one and is really a holy grail, really trying to develop and adopt a standard taxonomy and a recognition system for skills across an organization. Because again, you might have different parts, again, if you're a small organization, you might have just one learning organization, but in a company like IBM, we have 26 different learning organizations. Everyone defines skills a different way, or defines a role a different way. How do you really try and then bring things together so that you can have a standard journey, a job role based journey for a developer? No matter whether you're a cloud developer, you're a security developer, you're an artificial intelligence developer. A developer is a developer. So trying to get that common system of skills and credentials across within your organization and working with other organizations is really critical. I threw this this slide in at the last minute. This is work done by McKinsey. Again, I want to bring us back to the fact that we cannot have organizational resilience without personal resilience. And when you think about personal resilience, what really is going to help an individual be resilient and be adaptive for the future, no matter what the future brings along, is by building out these foundational skills. And, McKinsey did an amazing job of calling it out into these 4 different quadrants, right? Building out cognitive skills, interpersonal skills, digital skills, and leadership skills. But at the crux of it, it's these 3 things. One, how do we differentiate ourselves from machines, right? A couple of years ago, all the conversation was the robots are going to take my job. Okay, they might take some jobs, but how do you differentiate yourself from that robot? The robot can predict numbers, but can't do the inference. That is something that only you as a human being can do. So how do we differentiate ourselves? How do we add value? How do we efficiently operate in a digital environment? That's another thing that's going to be important. And the third most important thing is, how are we going to continually adapt to new ways of working? So in closing, I'll share with you what we talk about at IBM. So at IBM, it's a resilient organization, but it is resilient because we are constantly talking about a growth mindset, about being curious, about being open to feedback, and really about challenging ourselves and being lifelong learners. So, organizational resilience at the end of the day is all about being a lifelong learner and making sure that the organization fosters a culture of lifelong learning. So I've talked a lot. I am going to now stop. I'm sorry. I don't know if there were no questions. So either I bored you guys to death or you were just completely enthralled. One of the two. Hopefully it was the latter. No comments? Feedback?
I'll start the conversation off a little bit, but I do want to hear from everyone else in the room. And for me, Sonia, there was just a lot to digest, right? And in my day-to-day work, I'm not thinking at that level. So you really had me trying to come up a level, right? And think more globally around what am I doing and how am I approaching thinking about learning at my organization. And then the other thing that was happening for me is, and I think you spoke to this several times, some people on the call work at smaller organizations, right? So even just doing a skill assessment is huge. And then I work at a nonprofit. It's large. It's 12,000 people, but it's a nonprofit. So the resources to even do a skill assessment, like, whoa, how would I ever start that process? So that's what was happening for me in that presentation. So I've just offered that sort of as a feeding the fire here, or feeding the conversation, put it that way.
Yeah, I'll jump in too. I think that is absolutely spot on, Wendy, about the kind of level of the conversation. I really like how you took it and made us think more broad level about all the different skills and the learning environment overall, thinking about 2020 and where we go from here. So much to consider, so many great insights, and I can't wait to think about this a lot further. One question I did have with you, because I am very curious, I was wondering if you would be able to dive a little bit deeper and share your experiences a little bit more around that skills inventory that you talked about. I'm at a larger organization myself too, and I'm just very curious about how you went about it and some of the things you felt worked well, some of the things that you might stay away from. Anything you have more to share about that, I'd be really interested in learning.
So we've done two things, right? One, we actually ran an enterprise skills assessment. So what we did was based on, they created, I don't know how many roles they created, right? But they defined a whole bunch of roles and competencies under each one of those roles, and then asked us, each one of the individuals, to go ahead and rank yourself in terms of proficiency. So, 0 being, I don't know anything about, let's say, machine learning. 1 was, I've heard something about machine learning. 2 was, I've learned about it, but I haven't applied it. 3 is, I've applied it. 4 is, I'm an expert. So they basically gave you this range and asked you to go ahead and rank yourself on each one of the competencies that applied to your job role. So as a learning professional, there were a whole bunch of competencies that I had to go ahead and rate myself onto. And then my manager went and did the same thing, and then there was this conversation between me and my manager if there was a gap between what I had considered my expertise level was and he was, so we kind of came to a middle ground. And so that is how they went about trying to do a skills inventory for everybody. And then they use that as a way to map your learning for a future role. So I'm a learning professional today. I took this enterprise skill inventory, whatever it was, and I say I want to be an HR generalist. Now, the HR generalist has a certain set of competencies defined against it. So what it does is it takes what you have today and overlays what you need, and then calls out the gaps and says, these are the 10 areas where you don't meet the requirements. And then it makes recommendations for me in terms of learning. What can I take to fulfill those gaps? So that was one way we did it. The other way we did it was through badges. And, that was a more fun way to do it. But basically, every single learning, let's say a course, any learning asset, that they define that they think is badge worthy. So when they think about something that's badge worthy, it needs to be resume worthy. And they define the skills that you are acquiring. So when you define a badge, you can define the metadata associated with the badge. So let's say I did introduction to PowerPoint. So within Introduction to PowerPoint, what are the key skills that I acquired by going through this particular course? So the badge, Introduction to PowerPoint, if you click on that badge, and you can go to my LinkedIn profile, I have a bunch of badges on my profile. I'd encourage you to go click on those badges, because what it'll do is it'll open up, it'll tell you what I did, what does this badge indicate? What are the skills that I acquired? And then it'll also say what I did to get the badge. So did I attend a class? Did I present something? So basically, they were able to do some skills mapping with the help of the badges. So they could do like these heat maps, really figure out who has the skills where based on the badges. But yeah, there's no easy way of doing the skills inventory. And again, it's totally dependent on every individual to do it. It wasn't mandated. So some people did it, some people didn't, right? So that's a big thing. But skills assessment is a really, really big topic everywhere.
That was absolutely awesome. Thank you so much, Sonia, and thank you for the great presentation. Really great stuff. Thank you.
Absolutely.
I think you blew everyone's mind, Sonia.
No, I think it's just the end of the day and everyone's like, okay, I'm done. I want to put my feet up and watch a cheesy Christmas movie.
So Sonia,
Yeah.
where do you find the leaders to lead this? Because this, it really takes leaders that want people to aspire to great heights. Is IBM just full of them?
No.
So how do you do that? How do you go about engaging them in the possibilities?
It's, you put out a lot of training, you encourage, so I'll tell you, as far as where do you find these leaders, you've got to build them, you've got to develop them, right? They don't really exist. And then it's a lot of coaching. I know we all talked about how much coaching has come up, right, in the last in the last 2 years, but it's a lot of leadership coaching. One of the things that I found was really useful at IBM, especially during the pandemic, was they did a lot of panel presentations. So they pulled together random, very diverse panel of leaders, people with varied experiences from different groups, and they ran these open sessions. And I think that was one of the things which was most effective in as far as trying to teach leaders how to be empathetic. How do you think about talent, how to have those career conversations and things like that. But it's very hard, Hugh. It's really, really hard. I have taken a people management position after 10 years. I used to be a people manager, then I went to being an individual contributor. And now I've taken a people management position again. And some of the stories that that I hear from people, makes me stop and think and say, okay, what happened to all the people managers? Like, why are we not investing in our people? Why are we not thinking about our people? For me, I've told my team, you are my first priority. Everything else comes later, So it's hard. It's really hard. But I think, especially in a large organization, your experience is going to be great or awful based on your first line manager. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, thank you. But at least you know the current state, so you can start working at that level.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. It's been a real learning evening.
Sure. Anytime. So feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Sorry, happy to continue the conversation. Wendy, I know you had asked if, you can record, and I'll go ahead and send you the presentation too. So if you want to share that, happy to provide that too.
Great. That
Sonia.
would be awesome. Go ahead, April May.
Sorry about that. I just want to say I appreciate it, being from a company that is not global and is fairly local and small. What you shared in the presentation really was still very resonant and useful for me, and a lot of it really clicked. Personally at Imperial, we not only did the pandemic disrupt us, but our very industry has been completely disrupted. So the way all of us shop changes. And so we're at this moment where we realize we cannot be the same company in 2 years. And we had not really focused on what was going to be needed for the future, because we just didn't spend enough time talking about the future, because the future was so far away. And so hearing these things that you shared today was just so beneficial. It's where we're at now. And it's nice to see that some of the things that we're doing align with things that have worked for you at IBM, which makes me feel personally like I'm on a good track to help us get there. So I wanted to share that I really appreciated that ability to bring it home for me as well.
Great, thank you. I know it's kind of hard, again, I've spent the last 26 years at IBM, and that's all I know. And so, I try and bring it down and try and relate it to smaller organizations. And I'm glad I was able to, that, it did resonate for you. So happy to hear that.
All right. Well, I think we did it. And so I want to thank you, Sonia, so much for joining us this evening and giving us this mind-blowing presentation this evening. And I'm sure a lot of us are going to want to look at the recording and rethink this. So thank you again for your time with us. And thank everybody for coming and joining us this evening. I hope everyone has a wonderful holiday season. We'll see you in January.
Thank you. Happy holidays, everyone.
Thank you so much, Sonia. It was great. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you. Nice to meet everyone.